So what time do you have then, Aaron, or somebody? Is that clock not right?
Test.
Can you test it, Kate?
Testing, 1, 2, 3.
I hear you loud and clear.
Welcome. My name is Ann Lair. I'm from the Center for Human Capital Innovation, and we are so thrilled that you are joining us for NAVFAC Supervisory Academy. The purpose of the NAVFAC Supervisory Academy is to see how effective workforce development can be across NAVFAC within large populations. So we're starting with you, the supervisors, because supervisors are the backbone to NAVFAC. This is the 5th in our series of 6 webinars. In the past, we've talked about coaching with the ED, talked about building trust with the CMO. We also talked with Cindy Riedel in terms of feedback, and then we had Admiral Korka last time talking about purpose. And we are so excited today because we have a panel today to talk about career development. Let me introduce our panel. We have to my far right, the Business Director of LANT, Mr. Rick Roth.
Good afternoon.
Then we have, in the middle here in the pink, we have Kathy Stewart, Business Director for Southwest.
Oh.
And then we have Dr. Sam Roundtree right here, Business Director for Marianas.
Half a day.
Great to have all of you here. Thank you so much. Before we get started into career development and all the techniques and tools, would love for each of you to share how you got where you are now. Sam, we'll start with you and we'll go that way.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Ann. Glad to be here. I've had a varied career. I started out with some military service and then also some civil service. I've worked with the Department of the Air Force. I've worked with the Department of the Army, and now I'm with the Navy. I've had jobs in California. I've had jobs in Japan, and now I'm on the beautiful tropical island of Guam. All very rewarding experiences.
Wow, lots of variations there.
Lots of variations. Lots of variation. But fortunate to see different cultures in terms of different services and agencies.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Kathy?
So my career was not as varied as Dr. Sam's, but I did start out in the Civil Engineer Corps. And then after some time in the CEC, when I got out, I started my civil service career, the next best thing to working in uniform. But because I had an active duty husband, I was forced to move around to different jobs. And so most of my career wasn't environmental, but it was at a number of different places between installations and different echelons within NAVFAC and with BRAC. But one of the things I didn't realize at the time was how beneficial it was for me to be changing jobs every so often and demonstrating capability in multiple areas that ultimately helped me to get to where I am now.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you.
I've 30-year career in the Civil Engineer Corps. And then 5 years in the private sector, I saw an opportunity to get back to NAVFAC. I realized that NAVFAC would give me some leadership opportunities that I wasn't getting in the private sector. And in that time, probably had about 15 different jobs, 10 different moves. And it's made me recognize that as a civilian, how do we replicate that to some degree in the civilian workforce? You don't have to move 10 times. Maybe you don't have to do 15 different jobs, but do you move 2 or 3 times in your career? You know, what opportunities do you take to work at the various echelons, work in the various business lines that we have? So that's part of what I try to do when I provide career advice to folks, is think about that space a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So common theme I'm hearing is all over the world. Different jobs, different skill sets, and I'm hearing that maybe some of it a little unexpected and some of it maybe planned a little bit.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So before we get started into understanding how to do this that they have done and how you can help your directs and your employees do that, I want to just talk a little bit about housekeeping. We just have a few things for housekeeping. The first thing is there is a chat box, so please type in your questions for the Q&A, which we'll do at the end of our session. And please make sure that you keep those questions related to the actual content. We have back-end analytics that let us know that if you're here, so you don't have to announce that, but just type in your questions and our moderator will be checking on those. And then also just want to remind you to look at those yellow sticky notes that you see on your screen. That will give you all the information you need about CLP, the survey, that type of thing as well. Ready to get started?
Yes.
All right, let's go ahead and get started, and let's talk about this whole idea about providing career advice. What we want to accomplish at the time today, our objectives are very simple because this is a wide topic and we can't cover everything in this entire time. So what we do want to cover, though, is for you to understand, how do you have the conversation? And what are some tools and techniques that you can use with the people that you supervise so that they can develop their career, as well as you developing your career as well? How are we going to do that today? Well, our agenda is very simple. What we're going to be doing today is we're just going to be talking about two things. First of all, how do you define your career path? It's a big thing. And then also, how do you make progress on your career path when there's lots of things running all the time and operations are very high? So that's what we're going to be talking about. As we talk about this idea about careers and career paths, I think it's a good idea to just talk about the challenges that show up on a regular basis. And there are lots of challenges. First is just the idea of career. If you think about the definition of career, it actually comes from the 16th century and it actually means a road. And that's generally how people thought about their career, and even probably still do to a certain degree, that this is the road. I'm going to start here. I'm going to end here, and it's always going to be an upward trajectory. Not always the case anymore. And certainly it doesn't sound like the case for all of you. And so I think it's important for us to realize this career myth that a lot of us have bought into is that it always has to be a ladder, it always has to be one step up, and it always has to eventually get us to the top. And that's just a myth. Nowadays, we really would liken it to a jungle gym. We're going to be going over here, we're going to be going over here, maybe some up, maybe sideways, but really to think about it as for your own development as a supervisor, as well as for the people that you are supervising. If we can let go of that myth that I always must be going up, there's going to be a lot more opportunities. There's going to be a lot more chance to learn things and to go in different paths that may be unexpected and may be where you really want to go. So I just want to help you kind of think about that when you think about this idea about career paths. It doesn't have to be this straight trajectory. The other thing I want to talk about that's a challenge to having these conversations that we're going to be talking about, there's three things. First of all, organizations, you see on the left side of your slide there, are saying, we realize that there's going to be a dearth of the talent that we need who has the skills that we need. And we fully acknowledge that. So we have this organizations, these group of people, managers, supervisors who are saying, we need to invest in the time to get people to where we need so that we can grow strategically. However, if you look at the middle stat on your slide, it talks about Korn Ferry in their survey, and they were asking managers and supervisors, hey, how often and how important is it to you to learn the skill set of having these conversations? And it came in dead last. It came in number 67 out of 67. Because managers saying we don't know how to do it, and it's really not that important because we got all the other things we have to take care of. And then the third thing, if you see on the right side of the slide, is actual employees who are saying, you know what, we don't feel that we're getting developed the way that we want to get developed. So we have employees who are saying we're not really getting developed, so they're going to get disengaged, maybe not being as productive as they could. We have organizations who are saying we know there's going to be a shortage. And so you would think that the manager would say, great, we're going to make this a priority, and they're not for many different reasons. And so as you think about this conversation, really want everybody to understand no one's doing anything wrong. It's not like anything is something that is your fault. However, if we're going to match what organizations need and what employees need, we're going to have to take this out of number 67 and put it closer to the top in terms of managers and supervisors. And so as we start to think about that, these are just some statistics we want you to consider as you think about your own development. As you know, we always like to keep these interactive. We have the Q&A, and we also have polls. So here is our first poll. As we think about the previous slide, would love for you to honestly answer, how often do you intentionally have these conversations with your employees? So you see the choices there on the right. Go ahead and plug them in. You can go from rarely to occasionally to somewhat. While we're waiting for those answers, Rick, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here. How often do you have these conversations with your employees?
Probably not often enough, to be quite honest. And maybe more important than how often is how intentional and how informed are those conversations? And again, I don't think we do, myself, and probably others don't do as good a job as we could in that area. So part of I look at is what's a forcing function to make us better in that space. And I think one of the fundamental things is the IDP. IDPs force you to have that deliberate conversation that talks about career. But one of the reasons I think people have been reluctant to put a lot of time and effort in IDPs in the past is because we weren't able to extract much value out of them other than what we had at the individual employee level. You couldn't aggregate the data and start to see what the totality of training requirement was and get a better sense of where opportunities were to aggregate training in a more efficient, effective way. So we are working on something that would allow us to do that so that the time and effort put into developing IDPs, we could extract some more value out of. I think that having that forcing function will make us all better in that space.
Well, thanks for letting me put you on the spot, and thanks for your honesty. And I think we all can probably say we don't do it as well as we could have or as often as we could. And if you look at the poll results, it seems like the supervisors are agreeing. It's occasionally, which is fine, which means it's happening, it's just not happening as well or as often as they want. So that's what we're going to be talking about today is how do we put it up to the top of the list and make it a little bit more in terms of more than occasionally. So what we're going to be talking about today is two things, really. First is how do you define your career path, and then how do you make progress on the career path? So let's talk about the defining first, and what does that look like? So as you start to think about defining your career path, the first step is to understand what are your strengths and what are your areas of growth. Some people call those weaknesses. I'm a big fan of word choice. I really do believe that words matter. And so I actually prefer to use areas of growth than the word weakness because it shows we're growing. It shows that we're making progress. And so what we want to do is to think about where am I going in my career? Well, first of all, what am I really good at? And where do I need to continue to develop? There's something called a 360, which is we often say a 360 assessment. And what it is, it's a formal assessment. And a supervisor, a manager, an employee, someone would say, I want to get feedback and a 360-degree circle around me. That would mean the people that I report to, the people who report to, as well as my peers and my colleagues. That's what we call a formal 360. People tend to fill it out online, and then you get a report that tells you how it's all going. Well, it would be great if we could all get 360s, and they're really expensive. They take a lot of time. And it's not necessarily an opportunity for everybody. So what you see here on this slide is another version of that. We call that a 3x3. What do we mean by a 3x3 assessment? Well, there's 3 different levels that you want to talk to within the organization. In this case, we've listed IC, individual contributor, as well as colleague, peer, as well as manager, supervisor. That may not fit every position at NAVFAC, so maybe it's not going to be an IC, maybe it's going to be another position, but 3 different levels because we want to see what other people see in us that we don't see in ourselves. It's very hard for us to see ourselves without a mirror holding up, and so these assessments is like a mirror. And so we have 3 different levels, and then we're asking them just 2 simple questions. What are 3 of my strengths? What are my 3 of my areas of development? And that's why we call it a 3x3. It's a great way to gather data on how am I doing from different levels. And here's why it's important in relation to career development, because I may think I'm really good at something and I may think I've mastered it. And yet the feedback I get is you still have a ways to go. And so I would put that in the category of things to continue to develop. Could also be what we call a blind spot, which is I have mastered something and didn't realize it. And so the feedback I get is, you're really good at that. You don't need to spend any time on that. So doing a 3x3 or any type of assessment like that is a way for you to start to map out your career path. Where are my strengths? Where are my areas of growth? And from there, we can leverage the strengths, build the areas of growth to get where you want to go. Before we talk about getting to where you want to go, we'd love to have a conversation with the panelists because I'm sure I'm making this sound very easy. Just go talk to 3 different people and ask these questions, and it's not. Kathy, what are some pitfalls that supervisors, employees should avoid when we're trying to have these career development conversations?
From experience, I think there are a few things that can happen. I think one of my biggest challenges initially when having these conversations was really recognizing that the person that I was advising didn't necessarily want the same things that I did. So all of our career goals are not the same. Some people don't necessarily want a promotion. Some people want to stay in the job they're in and they want to master their craft. Some people want to move around to a number of different positions. So I think for me, listening was a big part of it, to really understand what the employee was looking for in order to provide accurate advice. Another thing that comes up a lot is sort of a magic formula. So sometimes employees want a magic formula. If I do X, tell me it will result in Y. And that's not always the case. There really is no magic formula. And then the last thing I think is not to be short-sighted when we're providing career advice, not only looking at short-term goals, but also looking at long-term goals. So where would you see yourself in the next couple of years? What positions do you think you would want to go to? And then a long-term goal could be something more broad, just where you want to see yourself in a number of years. It could be something like, I just want to be in a position where I have broad impact on an organization, or it could be something specific where it's a specific position.
So very specific things to avoid as a supervisor as you think about having these conversations. Yeah. Rick, we've talked about a 360 a little bit. I've talked about this 3x3. There's many different ways we can assess our strengths and assess our areas of growth. What are some ideas that you have that can help employees and supervisors think about this assessment piece?
So I think it starts with understanding what the competencies are, not only in the job that you're currently in, but positions you might be interested in. And that's the technical competencies, the foundational competencies for leaders, supervisory management competencies. Is how could you assess yourself or have someone help assess you if you're not sure what you're assessing against? So you need that as a basic backdrop. So how do you get that? Today, you primarily get that through our community management plans, but we're moving into a space where we're trying to provide more and better tools for you to do that. And so we'll talk a little bit later about command unit management framework, a workforce development framework, a continuum. And so there's a number of things that work in that space, but the idea would be is that it would lay out the basic competencies that people would need and then allow them to assess themselves and have others assess them against those particular competencies.
Great. So not just assessing strengths and weaknesses, assessing it against something,
Right.
and having that kind of foundation there. Great. Thank you. So Dr. Sam, I just have to ask you, say we do what Rick is saying in terms of assessing it against competencies or the 3x3 or whatever, and the employee comes to you and they say, sir, here is what I think I need to work on. What if you don't agree with the assessment?
Well, and in that situation, I think it's important to be genuine and provide feedback that's not anecdotal. In doing so, you want to engage the employee in a positive conversation to where they'll be more receptive to receive feedback, especially if it's viewed as perhaps maybe being negative.
So kind of going back to that coaching webinar, just really listening, maybe giving some feedback,
Giving
going to that
feedback,
feedback, and just
yes.
kind of being honest.
Being honest.
Great. Good. Thank you. So, Rick, I want to piggyback on something you said. You talked a little bit about some of the things that are happening at NAVFAC, and would love to hear from all of you, since you're all over the world. What are some elements of best practices in your region, in your area, that you know of that NAVFAC is using in terms of this idea of development?
Well, great. Rick mentioned about our community management plans. NAVFAC has been working on those plans for years, trying to refine those plans. It's a great way to map a successful career in a particular community. But what that plan is a partnership with the supervisor and the employee. So leadership's expectation is that the supervisor knows and understands the plan and then take time to sit down and map out that career path or that career goal with each and every employee.
So if I'm hearing it correctly, it's not really just the employee says, here we go, here's where I want to go. It sounds like it's more of a partnership between the supervisor and the employee.
That's correct. A partnership. Keyword, partnership.
Interesting. All right, great. Kathy, what are some elements of best practices you've seen?
Well, something that we're actually putting into practice at Southwest that I'm really excited about is a rotational program. So it's a structured way of really looking at when we have vacancies, how do we fill those vacancies rather than just picking a person and saying, here, can you act until we get a permanent position, where we're going through a little bit of a structured process to open it up to other people, fill the positions, number one, with LDP cadre members who need those rotations, but then anyone else who may be interested in getting experience outside of their business line or outside of what they typically do, so they can kind of try out a position. And it's mutually beneficial because you're learning, both sides are learning about the positions and learning more about the organization. The other thing that we're doing is we're identifying critical billets at our public works departments that we will not leave vacant. So when we have vacancies at these particular positions, we will take people from the Corps and fill those positions with people from the Corps. So it's mutually beneficial because we're having our Corps personnel who may not necessarily get field experience. They're getting that experience. They're getting a greater understanding of the challenges that our field experiences, and we're supporting our units of action better. So I'm really excited about it. We hope to have it online in the next few months.
Great. So is this going to be replicated across NAVFAC? We're just testing it in Southwest?
Yeah, I would hope so. I think in the Southwest, we'll do a pilot first, see how it works, see if it needs to be refined, and then hopefully it'll be replicated elsewhere.
Great. Good news. Rick, you touched a little bit about some elements of best practices. Anything happening at LANT or in general that you want to talk about?
So I think fundamental to career development is career aspirations. And the way people get those aspirations sometimes is by exploring different opportunities. So again, how do you do that? Well, one of the things that we've recently created is the Aspiring Leader Development Program, which gives an opportunity for those folks who are not already leaders, not already supervisors, to explore that space a little bit, see if it's something that they'd be interested in, but at the same time get some tools so that they can lead in the areas they're in, because everyone leads in some form or capacity, whether you're designated as a supervisor or whether you're assigned to lead a project. So I'm really excited about that program because it's going to give an opportunity for some junior employees that we might not have provided in the past and give them an opportunity to explore some things, because one of the key elements that's included in that is some rotational opportunities.
Oh, great.
So again, it gets kind of what Kathy just said. So I think the two sound very aligned, and it leads into something we're going to talk about later, which is the importance of experience.
So it's an ALDP, is that what
ALDP,
so that's what supervisors
yes.
should be looking for, is ALDP.
Right.
Great. Thanks.
I was just going to say that rotational is a powerful pillar, if you will. I think that's something that we really need to step up our game enterprise-wide, given rotational assignments. Because I have a lot of folks who are interested in trying to do rotational assignments, not only within a particular organization, but also external to other FECs to see how other things are done. So I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys do.
Yeah, excited about it.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so that was just one simple way to start to define the career path. And we talked about an assessment. We called it a 3x3 assessment. But as Rick said, there's lots of other ways you can do an assessment. But basically saying, where am I right now? What are my strengths? What are my areas of growth? From there, now that I know, and maybe because I've done a rotation or not, or I've talked to other people, I can start to think about where I want to go. So we have two tips here for you, as you see on your slide. The first one is what we call a from-to statement. And then the second thing is what we call 70-20-10. So let's talk about the from-to statement. So a from-to statement is a very simple statement that tells you, here I am, and I'm going here. I'm from here, I'm going there. So I'm sure all of us have had some kind of experience of plugging into Google Maps when you want to go somewhere, right? And if you keep it kind of vague, you say, I'm in Washington, D.C., which I am right now, and I want to go to Guam, let's say, for example. I type it in, it will get me there. If I type in the exact street I'm on to the exact street I want to go to, it's going to be a much better match. And so this idea of a from-to statement is exactly that, to get a closer match rather than, well, I just want to become the next level. What exactly do you want to be doing? So as you see here on the screen, what we're looking at, the from is kind of where are you right now and where do you want to go from? That's that strengths part of the assessment. And then where do you want to go? One really important piece here, the where you want to go is not about 15 years down the line. Right? The way it's too far. It's really about the next big step, not a huge step. You want to make it manageable. So 12 months, 18 months, something like that. So if we see on the next slide, we have an example of the statement. So I'm from an individual contributor who has technical expertise. So that's who I am right now. And it's been assessed. Those are my strengths. I'm really good at being an IC, an individual contributor. I've got great technical competence. And I think I want to go to a people leader who has a lot of strategy and is working with a team. And just being able to say that and write it down gives you a map, because it tells you the 3 things you need to focus on. So a people leader, what are the competencies? Going back to what Rick said about a people leader. When we think about the strategy, what are the competencies there? And then running a team. And so it's a way for you as a supervisor for yourself to make sure that you are developing. And it's also a way for you to start the conversation with your employees to say, let's talk about where you are now. You've got an assessment. Where do you want to go? All right, Guam is okay. Can we narrow it down a little bit? And that from to statement will help them do that. So it's just an easy way to have a conversation and start the conversation. Again, going to the listening, asking questions, hearing from them and helping them figure it out. Because sometimes it's a little hard. Well, I don't know, Guam just sounds like a great place. Well, let's dig a little deeper there. So that's one tip that we're talking about. The other tip that we want to share with you is a model called the 70-20-10 Adult Learning and Development Model. It's a lot of words for a very simple concept. And what the concept says is that in general, for people to grow in their career, you want to have a ratio of on-the-job or experiential learning, in this case that's the 70, of social or informal learning, in this case that's the 20, and of the formal learning, in this case is the 10. A couple of things I want to point out here. First of all, I know it says in the model 70-20-10. Don't get hung up. It's never going to be an exact blend. What we are looking for, though, is more experiential than formal and more social than formal. Is it going to be exactly 70-20-10? No, they're just guidelines. But for you to think about this, because I would place a bet that most of us in this room, as well as in the audience, when they think about training and career development, they think about sending someone to a course. Okay, that's great, Ann. You want to learn that? Let's send you to a course. And that tends to be our go-to. That tends to be what we know really well. And what this model says is that actually adults, it's only 10% is the formal. And 70% is experiential. It's what I'm learning. It's the stretch assignments. It's perhaps how I think about things a little bit differently. The social part or the informal part is the mentoring. Perhaps it's a coach. Maybe it's talking to people, having conversations, and then it's the training. So this can sometimes throw people for a loop. They're like, whoa, I thought I had to do a lot of actual concrete technical training. Very important. We need those skills as well as other competencies. And so this is just a way for you to think about, how do I help someone grow now that they know their from to statement? How do I help them go through the jungle gym knowing that it is not going to always be the straight path? And so just something to kind of think about in terms of a model there. As we start to move forward and think about this, it's a lot. It sounds like a lot. Supervisors are busy. Dr. Sam, if I'm a busy supervisor paying attention to this or the replica replay, and you hear all these things, a from to and a 70-20-10 and a jungle gym and an assessment, how do supervisors make time for all this?
Great question. You know, in our day-to-day whirlwind, as I call it, and those are the things that we have to do, our time is very scarce. But this is one thing that we've got to make time for. We've got to take this big rock and place it on a list of other big rocks and just make time. Now, I know that's easier said than done because we have to prioritize. And so if you're doing this, then something else doesn't get done. But this is important to not only our employees, but also to me as a supervisor, as well as the command. So we need to take every encounter with an employee as a potential opportunity to talk about career advancement or development, whether it's 5 minutes or 30 minutes. Again, just like we schedule other important and maybe not so important meetings on our calendars, we need to do the same as well. Now, in terms of the amount of time, it's all situational. depends on who you're talking to. But that's something that we just got to do. It's just like Nike's slogan. We just got to do it.
And are these formal conversations like, come where I'm painting, or come into my office if I have an office, or come down to the dock, or are these just like, I happen to see you? Like, how do you have these conversations?
Well, my experience has been, I think you gain a lot when it's kind of informal. You're really asking an individual about their career aspirations. You know, you can have that formal setting, right? And then you get an idea of what folks want to do. And then throughout the course of a period of time, you know, hey, how are you doing today, Susie? Well, what's your aspect? Are you working on that, which we talked about in terms of getting? I think you get a lot of benefit from that. And the employees, I believe, value that type of interaction.
Mm-hmm. Got it. So it doesn't have to be formal and, face to face. It could just be helping them kind of think about it, maybe leaving a question, having maybe some tips, and kind of having a conversation that way.
Well, I think it's both, because you'll have that formal discussion, as Rick mentioned, IDPs. That's a great time to have that formal discussion in terms of mapping out a plan. Mm-hmm. And then throughout the course of a period of time, you can have the informal as you're encountering each other on a day-to-day basis.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you so much. So, Rick, you mentioned your idea about the IDP. So we've talked about this idea of 70-20-10. So many different types of employees at NAVFAC all over the world. We have different types of grades. We have different types of skill sets, functional areas. How do we apply this 70-20-10 to all the different types of positions at NAVFAC?
So first of all, we haven't been doing it very well in the past. We haven't focused on the experiential piece. But I do want to reiterate something you said is, don't get too wrapped around 70-20-10 as if it's like we're engineers, a lot of us, not all of us. But, we kind of get locked into those things. And the important thing is what we're trying to do is think about the fact that if it's important that people learn through experience, how could we be more deliberate about it? So the leadership board, this is actually a topic of discussion because we presented the 70-20-10 model, and it got a lot of the leaders thinking there about this experiential piece and how do you structure that? How do you get at that? I can tell you one of the things that we are working on is almost like a course catalog. And in that course catalog, you'd have the technical, you'd have some of the other types of training available. One of the areas you would have in there would be some suggestions for how you might get that experiential piece. So that's one of the ways we're looking at trying to get after it. But I think everyone at the leadership board recognized we need to do a lot more deliberate thinking in this space. All of the communities have been asked to rewrite their community management plans by the end of the fiscal year. And one of the things we talked about is as they rewrite those plans, they need to be thinking about how they insert some of this experiential type training or experiential learning, I should say, experiential learning into the community management plans. That's not something that we've really spent a lot of time thinking about or doing in the past.
Mm-hmm. Wow, thank you so much. So we've talked about follow the plan and have the conversations. And Kathy, I don't think it always goes according to plan,
No.
at least in my experience. So what advice do you have for an employee or supervisor managing an employee where perhaps it looks like their career has gone off the rails?
My first piece of advice is to give it a chance. And then I use a very personal example because that very same thing happened to me, and I'll tell a little story. So when I was in the Civil Engineer Corps, you have a number of different jobs you can do, and one is construction, then there's public works, and then there's CB battalions. So I was going to my second job. I had just done construction. I was at a ROIC office, and I was going to my public works tour, and I was going to be the utilities officer. And I was very excited about my first public works tour, and I get there, and the public works officer sits me down and says, I'm ready to work. And he said, well, we're doing a little reorg, and you are going to be our energy and environmental officer. And honestly, my heart sank because my experience was when I was working in the construction office, I was thinking, oh, I hate when those people come on my job site. I don't want to do that. And as I learned more about it, I got more involved. I learned about how environmental supports the Navy mission, and I really got invested in it, and I really loved it. And I ended up spending the next I did 25 years in environmental. So it really goes to show that when you think you're off the rails, you may not necessarily be off the rails. And I know a number of people who have been in very similar situations that say, I never would have picked it, but it ended up being the best thing that happened to me. And so I've had to have those conversations with people when we're having to, because of resources, move people around. And in most cases, it seems to turn out okay. So my piece of advice would be to give it a chance. And also, I really like the analogy of the jungle gym, because there is no straight path. There's no straight road. It's not even a curvy road. It's many different paths that you can take. And about the analogy of the jungle gym, I read in that, it also, the jungle gym allows you a great vantage point from many different locations. So that is my advice. And I thought it was the best thing that happened to me. Although when I give advice, I don't say, hey, this could be the best thing that ever happened to you.
That's what the detailers always
yeah,
say.
exactly. You got to give it a chance. So
Great. Thank you so much. So we've talked about so far defining your career path, and how do you do that? Doing some type of assessment, whether it's a formal 360 or whether it's a 3x3 assessment. We've also talked about how to make progress on that career path, and you've given lots of valuable tips. Some of those tips that we've shared could be kind of really thinking about the from-to statement, as well as thinking about how do I make sure that I have that conversation, thinking about the 70-20-10. And again, those are just loose guidelines, but really upping that part about the experiential learning. And now it's time for action planning. As we said, every time we do a webinar, we want this to be practical for you. We want you to think about things that you can take away right now. So please go ahead and pull out, whether it was a piece of paper, if you've been to previous webinars, or some kind of tool. If you haven't been to a previous webinar, that's okay. But pull out somewhere to write down 2 things that you want to do and to focus on as you are thinking about having these conversations. While you're doing that, Dr. Sam, I'm going to put you on the spot. What's one thing from this conversation and the preparation for this conversation that you want to really think about as your action plan?
Rick mentioned early on about not having the career conversation, and I talked about just doing it, putting it on your calendar. So that's one thing that I'm going to really do when I get back, is just make the time for that, not only for my direct reports, but also for myself. Because folks believe that once you get to the senior levels, that's just it, but that's not true. I mean, there's other opportunities to move laterally as well as moving up as well. So that's one thing that I'm committed to do when I get back to the tropical, beautiful paradise
Of Guam.
So Sam, you made a good point, because in my short time as a civilian, I've made 3 lateral moves.
Right.
So those laterals. So yes, just because you're now 15 doesn't mean you don't want it to enrich your experience, and also provide the skills and tools you have in a way that the organization might benefit from, and others in the organization. Right. So I think it's a great comment.
yeah, great.
Great. So, as you know, we like to keep these interactive. We have the polls, keep them interactive, and we also like to hear from you. So now it's time for Q&A. So as you think about this, you have the chat bar, so go ahead and type in the questions that you want to ask, and then our moderator is standing by. And Kate, thank you so much for joining us for today. What are some questions we have coming in?
Thanks, Anne. I have a great question from Southwest for all panel members. What is the one pivotal decision or event in each of the panel members' careers that helped them achieve the career success that they've had to date?
Wow, the one.
Hey, just one. Well, there's been many, but but the one that I think stands out for me, I was working with the Department of the Army at a rather large installation, and we were going through workforce shaping. And although I would have not been impacted by it, but I still always looked for opportunities. And I was reading one day through the Federal Times where there was an opportunity in Guam, as a matter of fact, the Public Works Center of Guam. I think some of you remember that organization. So it piqued my interest. I decided to apply, was interviewed, and got selected. And it was the best move that I could have ever made, not only for me personally and professionally, but also for my family as well.
Mm-hmm. So what's the lesson there for the rest of us?
You just got to be opened to opportunities. You can't be you're myopic, and your aperture has got to be broad. And when you see an opportunity, you need to jump on it and take advantage of it, because truly they only come every so often.
Thank you. Kathy, you want pivotal moment?
Yeah, so I touched on it before with my example, and that definitely was pivotal for me. But I think the reason it was pivotal because I made a decision to invest 100% and give the position my all, the job, even though it wasn't exactly what I wanted to do. And I think it just demonstrated and proved to myself that I could really almost do anything, because it was something I didn't really know anything about and ended up spending a career in it. So that really was my pivotal moment. And so I think the lesson really is to invest and do everything you can to succeed in whatever position you are in.
Even if it's one that you hadn't planned on.
Exactly.
Got it. Rick?
Mine was probably, do you stay in or get out of the Navy?
Oh.
And, as a young person, you were led to believe, or was the people were trying to encourage you, it made you believe that it should be wonderful all the time. But it didn't feel wonderful all the time to me. So there was times when I was feeling like this job isn't what I thought it was going to be. Peaks and valleys. And the good thing is I didn't make a decision right away when I was in the valley. And at some point I found there was more peaks than valleys, and I actually ended up staying in for a 30-year career. But had I reacted too quickly to those moments when the job isn't going to be the greatest thing you ever thought you were going to have in your life, I would have reacted too quick. Mm-hmm. Given my personality and being a little bit more of an introvert, I might not have moved around on my own, because I was forced to take different jobs and I was forced out of my comfort zone every 2 years. It gave me this rich, rewarding life and experience that I would have never had. So that moment in time, I think, made a big difference. I don't think I would be in positions of leadership like I am today if I had gotten out and said, I'm tired of moving around. I'm just going to go work for the Bethlehem Steel or something and sort of take a job as an engineer. I don't think I would have be where I am today.
Thank you.
Yeah, Rick, I can identify with that. As I mentioned, we were going through a workforce shaping. Although I was not impacted, it just caused me to kind of say, well, I want to look around. I want to look at certain options and things of that nature. It was a forcing function, as a matter of fact, and which panned out to be the best thing. As I said, the best thing that really happened for me and my family.
And just one more note. So the forcing function, I was working in the private sector and the business was starting to fail. So at the time, I had a lot of angst and consternation about the fact that I'm not going to be employed. But that moment is what really drove me to look really hard at NAVFAC again. Oh. And I tell people all the time, I know some people probably don't believe it, but I actually really do love my job in NAVFAC. I love my job as a civilian in NAVFAC as much or more than when I was wearing uniform. That's how much I enjoy being in the BD space. That wouldn't have happened. Right. If that moment in time hadn't come and I hadn't acted, in that way and look for those opportunities.
So just I want to make one point with all of that. It's just with all the discussion about moving around, it also has to be sort of planned. Like you don't want to say, oh, here's a job, and then moving every 6 months, because that's not good either, because you're not learning enough to be successful and then move on. It's when you're ready to move on. That's really, which generally a lot of times happens after 2 to 3 years. Mm-hmm. So I just want to make that point as well, because we've all sort of touched on it.
Yeah, you get back to that deliberate and intentional.
Right.
Yeah. Thanks, Kate. What other questions do we have coming in?
I have a question for Sam from the Northwest. What advice do you have on how you navigate crossing from one series or another, or from wage grade to GS, for example?
Good question. There is no firewall between GS and WG that I know of. Both require that you have certain technical as well as leadership competencies in order to be qualified. And so you need to research and look at those requirements for the next position, maybe the next series, and then if you don't have that, then do what you need to do to try to get that to be marketable. But again, to cross over from one to the other, both have the same requirements.
Thanks so much. Kate, what are some other questions coming in?
This is for the entire panel. How do you balance career and family when you in senior positions?
So I'd like to take that one, Ann.
Please do.
I would like to take, because I get asked that question a lot. For those that know me, I have 5 children. They were all born within 9 years. 3 of them I had while I was still in the military, so it was definitely very challenging. And I had an active duty husband who wasn't always available to help, and with our moves, family wasn't around either. So it was definitely challenging, but I do have a few pieces of advice. And one of them I heard when I was listening to a panel that spoke, and it really resonated with me, was it's really about choices. It's not always work, and it's not always kids are home. It's a balance, and it's about when you make those choices and using judgment. So there may be those meetings where you have to stay longer, and just someone else will have to pick up the kids, or there may be those meetings where you say, okay, I'm going to send somebody else because I really want to go see my son receive his award. So that really struck me, because it sort of took what, really made me understand it is about choices and judgment. The second thing that I would say is having a good support network is really important. Just people to talk to that are going through the same thing that you are, because, misery loves company. No, not necessarily misery loves company, but somebody that can help you with some advice at times. And really, also delegating is really important as well. So if I had to do something with the kids, delegating, because that's mutually beneficial. It's giving somebody else that experiential learning that we talked about. And then the last thing is not to sweat the small stuff, that there may be times where you just can't get your son or daughter to practice, and it's okay. There are times you just can't do it all. You can't always dot every I and cross every T and have it all and be perfect all around. There has to be a little bit of give. And so, and the other point that I'll mention, though, is I was lucky to have some very supportive supervisors at NAVFAC along the way, which I think really built my allegiance to the organization, because I recognized that they supported me and they were thinking long term. They wanted me to be with NAVFAC long term. So that's something for our supervisors to think about as well.
Wow, thanks. Lots of things to think about there.
Yeah.
And I can share with you in terms of choices, right? Mm-hmm. What I've learned is you have to balance. It's a balancing. And love my wife. She sat me down one day and she said, hey, you're spending a lot of time in the office, a lot of less time here at home. So I want you to take a pad and just sit down and write down the things that you do in the office and how long that you take. And then for a week, add it up and get a feel for how long you've been out, and I did that, and it was an eye opener. So you're right. It's choices that you have to make. It's a balancing act. And so once I found that out, I was able to balance time. So when I needed to spend time away or more time in the office, it was very well received in terms, because my wife knew that I was going to compensate, right, in terms of giving that time back. Right. So that was pretty good. Yeah.
Good.
Great. Kate, what else do we have coming in?
I have a question from a participant. How do you help an employee build an IDP and complete their training to strengthen their competencies for positions where the KSAs are not readily known or written?
Wow.
Rick, you want to do that one?
Yeah. So one of the things I'm pleased to be able to say is that we've been working this space a lot for the last 2 years. We've developed some things that are all starting to come to fruition that I think will help in that regard, to give people some tools and some choices that make those conversations a little bit easier. We've established a community management framework, which tries to look at the things that are common to all employees, and then those things that are specific to a particular business line you sit in or a particular position that you're sitting in. And then ways you can maneuver from where you're sitting to where you would like to sit, using that framework and using the community management plans. We've also have been working behind the scenes at something called a workforce development continuum, which starts to look at functional competencies, which really aren't anything to do. Well, nothing to do is probably not completely right, but they're not essentially one for one with KSAs. It's not like you take someone's PD and you say, oh, this is what's needed. What we've done is that for all employees, there's certain functional competencies that we'd like to see people have that are foundational, that are leadership, that are supervisory, and then come up with the means methods that you can assess yourself and have others help assess you against those competencies. So I think with the tools that are coming out, and I'd say one of the big things is there was a time when we were starting on this journey, we just said, where are all the community management plans and how can you find them? We actually pulled them all together on one location, and we're creating a site on the portal where you go in there and you can access everything that I'm talking about today. And then the last thing is how do you put all this into an IDP? And that's where we're trying to develop the course catalogs, and then have an IDP that's more of an automated process that actually allows us to look across multiple IDPs and gain some information from it. So all those things are in play right now, and we're talking about a community management structure that's nearly ready to roll out, that many of these tools will become available within this fiscal year.
I wanted to take a minute to make a point and build upon what Rick is saying, because sitting here at the leadership board here in DC this week, there has been a lot of discussion on workforce development, community management, and really I think what we're going to be seeing is a real culture shift to really putting the importance on training. It's part of our strategic design, but really giving us the tools to help our employees with their training and development. And the culture shift really comes in is we are all busy, and we've mentioned, okay, how do we have conversations with our employees, but that there is a shift for an emphasis on making sure our employees are trained for the long term to help our organization succeed in the long term.
Wow, lots going on.
Yes,
again, kind of the language I'm hearing is focus, intention, deliberate, commitment. It's like this is now coming from 67, hopefully to closer to the top, to say this is who we are as NAVFAC.
And there's an expectation that we as supervisors, senior leaders and managers are taking that challenge on and developing our folks and getting very interested in their development. So that's something that you all need to think about, and what can you do, if you will, to kind of up your game in that area.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that great question. Kate, what other questions do we have?
This is a question for Sam. What is the best way to give advice to a subordinate that is older than yourself?
Great question. I think you have to start out with from an aspect of respect. You've got to understand, at NAVFAC Marianas, we've got a mature workforce. I was just running the numbers, and we've got folks that have got a lot of years of service, faithful service. And so when we have the new folks that are coming in terms of giving advice on how to do something, they've got to realize that this person has been perhaps doing this particular job for a long time, right? And yes, you may have a better way of doing something better. So you got to kind of take that into consideration when you're giving advice. Mm-hmm. And what I tell new folks is, and so maybe that first time that you try to pass that advice on and it may not be gaining any traction, then think about maybe your approach. Maybe if I approach differently, and let it become like a game, if you will, in terms of trying to convince an individual about something, or in terms of trying to give advice.
Great, thank you.
To build on what Sam said, also, I think both Rick and I experienced having that situation, being in the Civil Engineer Corps and being a very junior officer with very large civilian organizations that you had to supervise. But really, I think demonstrating also that you value their input and their experience, and really that you can learn from them as well. And having a little bit of a two-way conversation, I think really goes a long way as well.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Yeah, I always found a good dose of humility helps a lot. There's a tendency when you're young to think you know more than you know.
Yeah.
And so realizing that, I think, and going into your conversations with folks, and I think that occurs at any age, where someone who's been around the block a few more years actually deserves a hearing in a way that maybe someone who hasn't, because they probably gained some experience that you don't have. They probably do know many things you don't know. And so I think when you approach people with humility, those conversations go well. If you don't, they don't go well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Kate, do we have time to sneak in one more question?
Yeah, maybe two.
Okay.
I have a great question from PAC for Kathy, and it's along the same lines. How do you effectively have a productive career development conversation with a team member who's at the beginning of their career and is only driven by quick advances and pay raises?
I think really having the conversation to, sort of demonstrate that experience is incredibly important, that for their own benefit, you don't ever really want to be put in a situation where you're not prepared to handle the next job. And so one of the things I found, like I mentioned before, the magic formula, where there is a tendency, I think, for people to say, okay, I've checked block A and block B. Now it's time for block C. Why am I not getting block C? And it really is about experience. It's about character development. It's about some of the intangibles that really you get from just spending time in certain positions. So I would really focus on those elements of it and really give some examples, real life examples of how people, their careers have advanced, where they did spend many years in certain positions, really learning how to do what they're doing. So that's how I would advise an employee like that.
Thank you. All right, Kate, what's the last one?
Okay, one more. It's for all of them. How do you approach the selection of a good mentor fit? And this person's interested in answers from both seeking a personal mentor, but also when, as a supervisor, you're recommending a subordinate find one outside of their direct chain.
I can start with that because I get asked that question quite a bit. So my first point is that it's not just a matter of an individual employee hunting down a mentor. I found that what works best actually is if the employee speaks with their supervisor, and then their supervisor thinks about who might be a good mentor, because usually the supervisor has a network of folks that they know. They might know people up the chain as well as across, and can give that employee some pretty good advice on who might best serve them as a mentor. So versus going to some website and just putting in your information and hoping for the best, because I've seen that method tried as well and it doesn't usually succeed. So what that means, though, now to your second part of your question, is supervisors have to think about that a little bit. Like, when you look at your employees, who do you think might be a good mentor for them, and how do you engage people in that conversation to get the employee a mentor, in essence? And so you have to have your network, and you have to be willing to actually reach out to some of your peers, and actually sometimes upwards, and ask your boss. If you think you've got an employee who could really do well from mentoring in a certain avenue or a certain space, go to your boss and say, hey, I think this person could benefit, then what's your suggestion? So I do think it's not a matter of someone finding a mentor. It's actually a matter of the person that they work for working with them to help find a mentor.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, a lot of times I get those, I'm sure we all get those same questions. And a lot of times it's about knowing both parties and knowing sort of the chemistry and what will work to be able to make a good fit.
Yeah, selecting a mentor is, as you all know, I'm not saying anything that's not new, is a very important aspect. It's a big deal. And so you want to select someone that's going to be candid and honest with you. It's going to tell you when you don't have on any clothes, so to speak, right? And then in terms of mentoring someone, that is equally important in terms of selecting someone that you would like to pass on your experiences. Maybe you might help someone as well. But someone that wants to be mentored, right? Someone who really is looking to get that advice and will welcome whatever experiences that you can provide or you can bring to the table.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Kate. We're going to start to wrap up now. Don't leave yet. We still have some final thoughts from our panelists. Before we wrap up, just want to give you the next poll. And again, it helps us know how this is going. Remember, the NAVFAC Supervisory Academy is a pilot of 6 webinars, so please let us know, how did that webinar technology work for you? While you're doing that, just want to remind you about the Supervisor Forum. This is a great place for you to learn these things. Not only are the webinars in there and podcasts and articles, but people are putting questions in there and they're learning from each other, and it's a peer-to-peer learning. So if you haven't had time to check it out yet, I highly encourage you, check it out, get in there, learn, talk to each other so that you create a community of supervisors supporting each other. 2 other announcements we want to make before we wrap up with final thoughts. First of all, we do have one more webinar left in this series that is going to be May 1st with Admiral Korka, talking about setting expectations. Super important as a supervisor, so get that on your calendar now. And I wanted to let you know we are hearing from you. We know that people are saying, can you give us a little bit more information about the webinar? So we are going to be doing a call that talks about the first 3 webinars: coaching, trust, and feedback. So make sure, look for information on that. We'll send it out later, but it'll be a place where we can send you even more information about those 3 skill sets. So stay tuned. As we start to wrap up, I want to thank all of you for joining us. We know it's a lot of time out of your very busy day. Would like to thank each and every panelist for all the preparation you have done and for joining us and taking the time out of the meeting. And would invite each one of you, just a final thought you have for the supervisors about developing career paths.
And I just want to thank you for allowing me the opportunity to be here. But I just want to provide some advice or career advice to the supervisors. We truly work in a global enterprise. NAVFAC is just global. It's diverse, not only in its occupations and communities, but also in its geographical locations, right? So my experience has been, so when you're in an organization that has opportunities like that, you need to seek out, if you will, opportunities for growth, right? And so not only within your own organization, but if you're mobile enough, you need to kind of look for external organizations. As you all know, we've got sites from Dave Garcia to all of Europe. So take that opportunity to look around and try to advance that way. Thank you.
Thank you. Kathy?
Yeah, just one of the things I wanted to mention as a final thought is there is really no one more important to NAVFAC's success than our supervisors. Really, it's where, where the most impact can be felt is from our supervisors' actions. So, and it's not only in NAVFAC performance, but it's also in employee satisfaction, morale, retention, very important things for our success as an organization. So we all mentioned we don't take enough time. We really need to take more time. So take the time to schedule it because it really will demonstrate to our employees that you're invested in them. They will become invested in you and NAVFAC. They will support you, and it'll help our whole organization, our whole great NAVFAC organizations become better.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So I've learned as much by participating, I think, as I'm hoping folks listening have learned. But it's hard to top what these 2 folks have said, and I'm not tempted to top it. I think I just want to close with one piece that I'd like you to walk away with is that I'd say historically have looked at this career development as almost more like surfacing people's areas of weaknesses and then trying to figure out how you strengthen those. And I've read something recently where you're much better served by focusing on people's strengths and building on the strengths. And Tom Landry, when he used to coach his players and he would do game film, most teams run the game film and show the players all the things they did wrong. He would actually show them when they did something well, and he would say, you need to do more of that. Mm-hmm. So I think we can do some of that in our career advice and some of our coaching and mentoring, going back to some of the previous supervisor academies. So think about how you could emphasize the strengths and speak about strengths versus focusing on weaknesses. Because the mind shuts down as soon as you start talking about something negative and weaknesses, and the mind opens up as soon as you start talking about somebody's strengths. So if you want to reach someone, you're better off talking about strengths because their mind will open to what you're saying.
Thank you. Thank you again to all of you. Thank you to all of you. Come back May 1st with Admiral Corca on setting expectations. Enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you.
No, that was pretty good. Yeah. I think it was. I enjoyed it.
I feel like a news thing.
Yeah.
I know. This is where they get their pay for it. That's right.
No, you guys all did great.
You did
too.
awesome.
Oh, you did. Yeah, you were awesome.